John Deets was last seen on December 30th, 1988, when he was working as a truck driver for Westside Transport, a company based in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. He had just made his final delivery at the West Coast Grocery Co. in Spokane County, Washington, and called his employer and wife to check in, letting them know he would be heading home soon. But after that, John was never heard from again. His wife became worried when she didn't hear from him, and his trucking supervisor reported him missing shortly thereafter. As time went on, the mystery deepened. In the months that followed, investigators began to connect John's disappearance to a man named Ralph Howard Benson. Benson was a self-employed, long-distance trucker who frequently traveled across the country. Less than 2 years after John vanished, Benson was spotted driving a new truck that was remarkably similar to the one Deets had been driving before he went missing. The truck was worth around $100,000 and had been repainted, which immediately raised suspicion. In early 1991, Deets' truck was discovered on Benson's property near Los Angeles, California. The 1988 license plate for the truck was also found at Benson's home in Davenport, Washington. It appeared brand new and unweathered, a clue suggesting that the truck had been in Benson's possession for a period of time. Authorities believe Benson operated a chop shop, where stolen tractor-trailer rigs were dismantled and sold for parts. Despite the connection between Benson and Deets' truck, no charges were ever filed against him in relation to Deets' disappearance or his vehicle. The investigation into Benson's life would later take a darker turn. In 2003, he was convicted of the brutal murder of a Washington state fuel tax auditor. Benson had shot the man in the head and dismembered his body, which pointed to a disturbing pattern of violence. He became a person of interest in several other unsolved missing persons cases and homicides, including the disappearance of John Deets. Benson died in prison in September 2004, just under a year into his sentence for murder. He was 64 years old at the time of his death. Despite his passing, the mystery of John Deets' disappearance has never been solved, and his family is left with unanswered questions about what happened to the responsible, dedicated father and husband who vanished without a trace. Deets had been carrying company credit cards at the time of his disappearance, but none of them were used after he went missing. He also left behind 3 children in 1995. He was declared legally dead, and his wife has since remarried. Foul play is suspected in his case. Gail Doyle was last seen on the evening of June 2, 2016, at the Boulevard Tavern in Olympia, Washington. At approximately 10 p.m., she was involved in a heated argument with James Stidd. The altercation reportedly stemmed from a criminal case involving Doyle's son, who had allegedly used Stidd's credit card without permission. Despite the tension, Doyle and Stidd left the bar together. Getting into Stidd's car, a blue 1996 Honda Civic with a gray hood and the license plate number ACM 7289. According to Stidd, Doyle asked to be let out of the car on Martin Way, near the Azteca bowling lanes, and this was the last time he saw her. After that, Doyle vanished without a trace. She has never been heard from again. In the days following her disappearance, Stidd's behavior became increasingly suspicious. On June 4th, just 2 days after Doyle was last seen, Stidd purchased a pressure washer, which he used to clean his garage floor. He then took 2 plastic bags to the Thurston County Waste and Recovery Center, where investigators later searched, but only found animal remains. This action raised red flags for investigators. As the investigation progressed, police discovered blood inside Stidd's house, including traces of blood in the garage. Disturbingly, a blood-stained hammer with blonde hairs wrapped around it was found in the garage, along with the blood-stained handle of a buzzsaw. However, the saw blade was missing. These findings led investigators to suspect foul play. They arrested Stidd within days of Doyle's disappearance, charging him with second-degree murder, evidence tampering, and unlawful possession of a firearm. Stidd denied any involvement in Doyle's disappearance, maintaining his innocence throughout the legal proceedings. However, in 2018, after a trial, he was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 41 years in prison. Given his age, 69 at the time of the conviction, It's unlikely that he will ever be released from prison. Despite Stitt's conviction, Doyle's body has never been found. Investigators suspect that her remains may be in a landfill, though no definitive evidence has been uncovered to confirm this theory. The case remains a tragic example of how an argument over a financial dispute escalated into violence, and the mystery of what truly happened to Gail Doyle continues to haunt her family and the community. Foul play is strongly suspected, but without her remains, the case remains far from closure. Beverly Cummings was last seen in Federal Way, Washington, on the morning of July 18, 1990. She had plans to run errands, including going to the grocery store and the post office. She told her family she would return by 9 a.m. to babysit her granddaughter, but she never returned, and by the time her loved ones checked the location she mentioned, there was no sign of her. Her family was immediately concerned, as it was completely out of character for Beverly to vanish without a trace. They learned that the mail had not been collected from the post office, and no one had seen her at the store, deepening the mystery of her sudden disappearance. Beverly's loved ones were left with more questions than answers. Several weeks later, over Labor Day weekend in September 1990, a significant clue emerged. Beverly's brown 1977 Toyota Celica hatchback, with the Washington license plate number UKM 353, was found abandoned on a Forest Service road, about 3.5 miles off Highway 410 in Greenwater, Washington. The car had been left there for some time, and locals in Greenwater reported that it had been sitting in that same spot since mid-July. A man came forward, admitting that he had found the car and driven it to Auburn, Washington. However, authorities did not consider him a suspect in Beverly's disappearance. The discovery of her car did little to explain what had happened to Beverly. She had left behind all her personal belongings, her makeup, clothing, and anything else she might have needed for a trip. Additionally, she had not used her bank accounts or credit cards since she went missing, further suggesting that her disappearance was not voluntary. At the time of her disappearance, Beverly was in good health, and her marriage was described as happy. There seemed to be no reason why she would have wanted to leave her family behind. Angela Gilbert was last seen in Granite Falls, Washington, on June 2, 2011, between 10 o'clock and 11 o'clock a.m. She was walking with a male friend, Colton Lee Coltwhite, on private timberland near the 21400 block of 119th Street Northeast. According to White, he and Gilbert were walking together when she decided to continue on the walk by herself. He returned alone, claiming she chose to go on ahead. After that, Gilbert was never heard from again. 3 days later, Gilbert's mother reported her missing. Authorities began searching the area and found one of Gilbert's shoes near the South Fork of the Stalagmish River, close to the fish ladders. Despite an extensive search, there was no other sign of her, and her disappearance remains a mystery. A few days after Gilbert went missing, White himself was reported missing. However, it is believed that he disappeared on the same day as Gilbert, June 2, 2011. White's body was discovered in the Stalagmish River in July 2011, and it was determined to have been in the water for several weeks before it was found. The cause and manner of his death have never been released, and authorities did not have the opportunity to question him about Gilbert's disappearance before he died. The relationship between the two cases remains unclear. At the time of Gilbert's disappearance, White was wanted for failing to appear in court on June 16, 2011, for charges of reckless burning and second-degree assault. Gilbert, too, had a history of legal troubles. She was wanted for felony escape at the time, having failed to return to jail after a 4-hour furlough on May 20, 2011. Additionally, she missed a court hearing for drug charges a week later. Despite her legal issues, her family insists that it was uncharacteristic of her to be out of contact with her children. Gilbert left behind 6 children, and her disappearance occurred shortly before her youngest daughter's birthday. This has added to the heartbreak and uncertainty surrounding her case. Her family has continued to seek answers, but so far, Gilbert's case remains unsolved, and there are no known leads in her disappearance. Rwand Denani was a well-known figure in the Redmond, Washington community, owning the Celtic Bayou restaurant. On the night of April 1st, 2016, a devastating fire broke out at his establishment. Igniting just after 1 o'clock a.m., emergency responders arrived quickly, battling the explosive blaze that caused significant damage to the building. Miraculously, no one was injured, and the fire didn't spread to nearby structures. Investigators later determined that the fire was arson, and a man was seen fleeing the scene shortly after it started. At the time of the fire, Denani was working at a Dairy Queen in Auburn, Washington, until 2 a.m. on April 1st. Later that morning, around 5 a.m., the police visited his home to interview him about the fire. He was not considered a suspect, but authorities believed he might have valuable information related to the arson investigation. That same day, Denani went to the Redmond police station to provide further details about the fire. However, after his visit to the police station, Denani mysteriously disappeared. His family was unable to reach him, and he was last heard from at 11 p.m. on March 31st, when he told them he planned to work a few more hours at the Dairy Queen. By later that day, he had vanished without a trace. The Dairy Queen where he worked became a key location in the search for Denani. His vehicle was found abandoned in front of the restaurant, with his wallet and identification still locked inside. His cell phone and jacket were also left behind. Investigators noted that Denani had no history of disappearing, and his sudden absence raised concerns for his safety. Though Denani was not a suspect in the fire, authorities were increasingly concerned about his well-being. His disappearance, combined with the fire at his restaurant and his uncharacteristic absence, only deepened the mystery. His family continues to hold out hope for answers, but as of now, Denani's case remains unsolved. Gilbert Gilman was last seen on June 24, 2006, in Thurston County, Washington, when he went for a day hike in Olympic National Park. He had planned to meet a co-worker that day but missed the appointment and has not been heard from since. His co-worker reported him missing on June 25, 2006, after he failed to show up. Gilman's silver 2005 Ford Thunderbird convertible was found a few days later at the Staircase Ranger Station off State Route 101 in the Olympic National Park. The vehicle was believed to have been parked there since the day of his disappearance. Despite an extensive search of the park, no trace of Gilman was found. The rugged terrain of Olympic National Park, which includes dense forests and steep, rocky hills, made the search difficult, but nothing pointed to his whereabouts. At the time of his disappearance, Gilman was in good health and had excellent survival skills, thanks to his military training. He was also an avid outdoorsman, which further raised questions about what had happened to him. Authorities and his family entertained the possibility that he may have left intentionally, possibly as part of a planned disappearance. His bank accounts were monitored in case there were signs of activity that might point to him being alive or planning to resurface. Speculation around his disappearance has also suggested that it could be related to his work. At the time, Gilman was the deputy director of the Washington State Pension Fund. He had previously worked as a military interrogator with experience in counterterrorism and counterintelligence. His career also involved international assignments, including working with the United Nations, and he had traveled to various countries such as Belgium, the United Kingdom, China, Panama, Israel, Kuwait, Somalia, and Iraq. His background raised the theory that he might have gone underground, possibly becoming a spy for the U.S. government, although there is no evidence to substantiate this. Gilman had only recently moved to Washington from New York before his disappearance. His mother believed that he had gone off on his own as part of some covert mission, but again, there was no hard evidence supporting that theory. To this day, Gilman's disappearance remains unsolved, and authorities continue to investigate, but the case remains one of the many mysteries surrounding the Olympic National Park. Lee Elliot was last seen on May 27, 2018, in Bainbridge Island, Washington. He and his girlfriend, Joan Burns, were in a two-seater fixed-wing, single-engine 1974 Cessna 150 aircraft when it crashed into Eagle Harbor at 5:13 p.m. The plane plunged into the water and sank quickly. Boaters who witnessed the crash rushed to the scene and found Burns floating in the water, bleeding from her injuries. She was airlifted to the hospital in critical condition, but survived. However, Elliot was nowhere to be found, and an extensive search in the following days turned up no trace of him. Burns later spoke to authorities about the events leading up to the crash. She said the plane, piloted by Elliot, had not experienced any mechanical issues. After taking off from Vashon Island, they flew low to the water to look at some seals near the shore. Burns expressed concern that they were flying too close to the water, but Elliot reassured her, stating that everything was fine. He then looked down at the iPad he was using for navigation and pushed the flight control yoke forward. The plane then crashed into the water near the mouth of Eagle Harbor and flipped over. Burns blacked out, but later regained consciousness. When she came to, she saw Elliot slumped over in his restraints, appearing to be unconscious. Burns was able to free herself from the wreckage and was rescued, but Elliot was still missing. In June 2018, a dive team located the wreckage of the plane at the bottom of the harbor, 180 feet underwater. They returned later to recover it, but the wreckage was no longer there. Despite further searches, the wreckage has not been found again, and Elliot's body was never recovered. Given the circumstances, it is presumed that Elliot died in the crash, and his body was lost in the water. His disappearance remains unsolved. Law on February 23rd, 2 days after Flink's disappearance, her brown leather wallet was found on a sidewalk in Hoquiam, Washington. The wallet was mailed to her post office box in Aberdeen, but Flink never picked it up. The following day, February 24th, the car she had been driving was found parked outside a tavern in the 700 block of J Street in Hoquiam. Despite these discoveries, there were no signs of Flink. Flink had a complicated relationship with Barb Askia. She had been involved in a custody battle over her young son with Askia's family. Flink's ex-husband had wanted the Askia family to adopt his child because he believed Flink was too young and unprepared to care for him. During this time, the child spent extended periods with the Askias while Flink worked long hours. Eventually, just before her disappearance, Flink gained full custody of her son. The custody dispute between Flink and Askia had led to altercations between the two women. Flink's roommate was aware of the tension and had advised her not to go to Moclips alone. However, Flink decided to go by herself after two friends who had been willing to accompany her were unable to. For years, Askia claimed that Flink had never arrived in Moclips, but in 2006, during a phone interview while she was living in Georgia, she changed her story. Askia admitted that Flink had indeed arrived in Moclips, and the two women had gone to the Moclips tavern for drinks afterward. Askia, who was in poor health at the time of the interview, did not elaborate further. Following this admission, a detective flew to Georgia to confront Askia and ask her to reveal where Flink's remains were. The detective promised there would be no prosecution if Askia confessed. However, Askia replied, "I can't help you with that," and she passed away in 2008 without ever admitting to any involvement in Flink's disappearance. At the time of her disappearance, Flink was working as a waitress at the Blue Beacon in Aberdeen and had no other source of income. After she vanished, her son was raised by his grandparents and did not learn that his mother was missing until he was a teenager. He still hopes for closure and an explanation regarding what happened to his mother. Authorities believe that Flink was likely murdered, with Askia being the prime suspect. However, they also believe that Askia did not act alone in Flink's disappearance. Despite the suspicions surrounding Askia, Flink's case remains unsolved, and no one has been charged in connection with her disappearance. Esther Gesler was last seen in Auburn, Washington on March 13, 1976. At around 11 a.m., she told her husband and children that she was leaving to rent a hotel room so she could be alone and study for an upcoming college final exam. Esther was taking night classes to become a paralegal secretary. She was driving a metallic blue 1973 Mercury station wagon and told her family she would return the next day. Earlier that day, Esther kept a hairdresser's appointment in Auburn. However, She never returned home and has not been heard from since. Her car was found abandoned in a municipal parking lot at 1st Street Northeast and B Street in Auburn, Washington. Despite a thorough investigation, authorities were unable to determine her whereabouts, and her disappearance remains a mystery. Investigators believe that Esther was murdered by her ex-husband, Glenn Allen Bagley. At the time of her disappearance, it was his car that Esther was driving. Phone records show that Bagley called her a few days before she went missing. This, along with other circumstantial evidence, led investigators to suspect him in Esther's disappearance. Authorities also believe that Bagley may be responsible for the 1973 disappearances of Althea Blankenship and her son Jeffrey. Althea and her son were living in a small rented apartment inside Bagley's home in Port Townsend, Washington, and he was the last person known to have seen them before they vanished. After Esther disappeared, Bagley moved to the Philippines, where he worked as a civil engineer in the capital city of Manila for many years. Despite numerous attempts by Washington police to build a case against him, Bagley refused to speak with investigators about the disappearances and maintained his innocence in all 3 cases. In 2004, Bagley's then-girlfriend, who had initially supported his alibi, recanted her story. She told police that Bagley had threatened her life, saying that if she ever revealed anything he had told her, she would end up in the same culvert in Kilsina as Esther. This statement further fueled suspicions about Bagley's involvement in Esther's disappearance. Bagley died of cancer in the Philippines in February 2016. Despite his death, Esther Gesler's case remains unsolved and foul play is suspected. Authorities in Kent, Washington continue to investigate her disappearance, but so far, no one has been charged in connection with her case. The mystery of what happened to Esther Gesler endures. James Argot was last seen on July 2, 2006, at the Sportsman Cafe in the 6400 block of North Market Street in Spokane, Washington. He had been at the cafe in the evening, but by the following day, he had vanished without a trace. His gold Pontiac Sunfire was found abandoned on July 12th. Witnesses reported that the vehicle had been driven by John Wayne Thompson, a man who was unfamiliar to Argot's family but had a troubling criminal history. Thompson, who had 3 prior rape convictions, was a suspected serial killer. His name became more infamous after an incident in Victorville, California, on August 7th, just a month after Argot's disappearance. Thompson attempted to carjack a woman, but the situation was interrupted by 2 Victorville Daily Press employees who restrained him with zip ties until the police arrived. After his arrest, Thompson was charged with the murder of Charles Ray Headland, a California man who had been fatally stabbed during a botched carjacking. In addition to Headland's murder, Thompson confessed to killing Argot, along with another victim, Lori Ham, a woman from Washington who had gone missing on July 16, 2006. Thompson claimed that he met Argot while walking along a road at High Bridge Park in Spokane. According to his account, Argot made advances toward him, which pissed off. In a fit of rage, Thompson decided to kidnap Argot and steal his vehicle. Thompson claimed that while they were driving around Spokane, he shot Argot in the head. Afterward, he abandoned Argot's body near a creek under a bridge in Idaho, though he was unable to provide a specific location. Despite an extensive search, authorities were unable to locate Argot's remains, but they believed Thompson's confession to be true. Thompson also admitted to killing Lori Ham, a woman he had met at a bar. According to him, Ham invited him to go shopping, but when the conversation turned to her ex-boyfriend, Thompson became angry and shot her in the head. Thompson was convicted of Headland's murder and sentenced to death in 2014. However, he never stood trial for the murders of Argot or Ham. On May 2024, Thompson died of natural causes while incarcerated in a California prison. Although Argot's body was never recovered, foul play is suspected in his case, given the circumstances surrounding his disappearance and Thompson's confession. Rose Eaton was last seen in Cheatham, Washington, on July 25, 1994. She had been living with her son, who was preparing to take her to the dentist that day. However, just as they were about to leave the house, Eden's son noticed that several of his stock animals had gotten loose. He decided to attend to the animals, leaving Eden in the car with their German Shepherd dog. When he returned to the vehicle just 10 minutes later, he was shocked to find that Eden was gone. Her purse was also missing, though the dog was still there. Eden's son immediately began searching for her, first checking the area by the road and then going back to the house, which was still locked. Realizing that his mother had disappeared, he contacted the police. An extensive search of the surrounding area ensued, but there was no sign of Eden. Tracking dogs followed her scent for about a third of a mile along a dirt road, but the trail ended at the junction of that road and Beaver Valley Road. From there, the scent was lost, leading investigators to consider the possibility that Eden might have been picked up by a passing motorist. At the time of her disappearance, Eden had been struggling with dementia, which had made her increasingly difficult to care for. Her son had been exploring other living options for her, but she was adamant about continuing to live with family. Financially, she had almost no money and she did not drive. Although foul play is not suspected, her case remains unsolved, leaving many questions about what happened to her that day. The circumstances of her disappearance, combined with her mental condition and the limited evidence, make it a challenging case for investigators to resolve. Kayla Craane lived a life that was both unpredictable and full of hardship. At the time of her disappearance, she was living in Chehalis, Washington. She was unemployed, often on the move, and struggled with addiction. On May 5, 2010, a friend of Kayla's reported her missing, as she hadn't heard from her since April 20th. The last known sign of Kayla's activity was a login to her MySpace account on April 28th, but after that, she seemed to vanish without a trace. Despite the best efforts of friends and family, Kayla was never seen or heard from again. The people who knew Kayla best described her as someone who had faced a lot of struggles. Her friend who reported her missing mentioned that Kayla had long been battling drug addiction, which ultimately led to her losing custody of her child. She was also said to have been involved with a man who had previously threatened her life, which raised serious concerns about her safety. Kayla had a tendency to frequent various places in the surrounding counties of Lewis, Grays Harbor, and Pierce in Washington. She had become a familiar face in these areas, but even then, her life seemed to be slipping further out of reach. In the years that followed her disappearance, there was little hope or resolution. Then, in November 2015, a startling update came from authorities. Investigators shared that multiple witnesses had come forward with information suggesting that Kayla had died from an accidental drug overdose shortly after she was reported missing. This overdose reportedly occurred in North Cowlitz County, Washington, and her body was said to have been buried in a remote, heavily wooded area in Oregon. The news was devastating yet puzzling. How could such a tragic end have been hidden for so long? Authorities said they had identified the people believed to be involved in disposing of Kayla's body. However, despite this discovery, they were not seeking charges against anyone. Their primary goal, it seemed, was to recover Kayla's remains in the hope of providing her family with some semblance of closure. Yet, despite the leads, the case has never been fully resolved, and her remains were never found. Linda Endorf was last seen on December 8, 1976, after she finished her shift at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. She worked as a ticket agent for Western Airlines and had been working that evening until about 10:30 p.m. when she left the airport to head home. She had been expected to return to work on December 15th, but she never showed up, and she has never been heard from again. On December 17th, more than a week after Linda was last seen, her husband, James Endorf, reported her missing. By that time, her absence had raised concerns among family and friends, and her disappearance was investigated by law enforcement. Despite the extensive search, no one could find Linda, and she had seemingly vanished without a trace. Linda had a 13-year-old daughter at the time of her disappearance. She and James had been married since 1963, and their relationship appeared normal until Linda went missing. However, 2 months after Linda's disappearance, James filed for divorce. The divorce was finalized in 1978, and James was granted almost all of the couple's property and assets, as well as custody of their daughter. As authorities looked into Linda's disappearance, they found that she had never used her Social Security number, never had any contact with law enforcement, and had not been seen by anyone after December 1976. These unusual circumstances made her case even more perplexing. No one had any information about where she might have gone or why she had disappeared. Then, in January 1993, a new and chilling turn occurred in the case. James's second wife, Deborah in Endorf, went missing. The next day, her body was discovered in the trunk of her car in Tacoma. She had been strangled with a bungee cord and had a fractured skull. Investigators were immediately suspicious and began to piece together the events surrounding her death. James, however, hired an attorney and refused to cooperate with the investigation into Deborah's murder, even in the early stages. His refusal to help authorities raised suspicions. 1 month after Deborah's death, James died by suicide, gassing himself in his truck. He left a note behind, but it did not confess to his involvement in either Linda's disappearance or Deborah's murder. The homicide investigation into Deborah's death was closed after James's suicide, with police stating that he had been their primary suspect. They had been preparing to file murder charges against him for Deborah's death. According to reports, Deborah had confided in others that she mistrusted James and feared that he might kill her. In addition, investigators found bloodstains on the garage door at the couple's home, suggesting that Deborah had been attacked there. With James's death, the focus shifted back to Linda's case. The investigation into Linda's disappearance was reopened after Deborah's murder, but despite efforts to find new leads, authorities were unable to uncover any additional evidence. Linda's case remains unsolved, and she is considered missing under suspicious circumstances.